Hey everyone, Chris here with another filler video, and this time we're going to talk a little about the DOS Games Jam, which happened recently, occurring between March 1st and April 15th. And for starters, I should mention that I'm personally not really into game jams. I don't have a problem with them existing or people taking part in them or anything like that, it's just not something I myself am interested in. But this one got a lot of attention when it was going on, so I figured I'd talk a little about it and show some of the games which came out of it. The goal of this particular game jam was not to make a bunch of DOS games. Heck, it even says it right here in the rules. The game should be inspired by PC games from the DOS era, meaning it doesn't have to actually conform to any standards or anything. So long as your inspiration was DOS gaming, you're good. This is pertinent because as we get to the list of games here, you're going to notice the majority of them do not run in DOS. Most of them are either Windows executables or browser plugins working off of Unity so that they can be played on any system that supports the Unity engine. Also, this game jam wasn't about racing to finish games either, as some game jams are. This one allowed submissions of any kind, be them old games, unfinished games, prototypes, fully published games, anything at all really, provided it wasn't hateful or bigoted. Overall, there were a total of 123 submissions for the month and a half that this ran for, and we're going to take a look at some of them. A few selected by my Patreon supporters, and a few selected by myself. Although one thing I should point out before we get to the games themselves is that there was a second DOS Games Jam going on at the same time as the one I'm focusing on today, with the other one going from February 28th to May 10th. However, that one was a proper race, with all submissions required to be capable of running in an actual DOS environment, and as such, only saw a total of 15 submissions. I should also say that for the 8 games from the DOS Games Jam that I'm taking a look at today, I've decided to order them from what I consider to be the least impressive to the most impressive. Not necessarily in terms of its state of completion or features, but rather what I consider to show the most promise or potential, or what I feel is the most interesting from a technical standpoint. Now, this isn't to say there wasn't anything worse or better than what we've got picked out here, this is just my ranking of these 8 games relative to each other. So at number 8, we have Topia 2, which is surprisingly one of only 3 games we picked out which runs in an actual DOS environment. But I had to put it at the bottom of the list because it's barely much of anything. It's technically a sequel to another game featured in the Game Jam, but the author, Superleaf 1995, barely had much of a chance to get far into it. The main gameplay itself is extremely incomplete, especially considering that you run out of money within just a couple moves and there's no polish to anything, not to mention system fonts all over the place. And in the main menu, the load game and options buttons both just result in a black screen of nothing. In retrospect, I probably should have taken a look at the original game once I saw the state this was in, but then I noticed it wasn't completed either. Now, given that this was one of the last games I looked at, and because time wasn't on my side this week, I decided to just move on. Next up, we have Astro Lander, a browser-based Unity game developed by Dragon Duck. Now, this is meant to be like Gravitar and other 2D side-scrolling shooters with a gravity mechanic, with the goal being to collect all the cargo in a level and land on an appropriate landing platform. Although this doesn't look like too bad a game at first glance, I have 2 main issues with it, which led it to be so low on this list for me. The first is that, well, I don't see the DOS inspiration. This is an HD game with graphics more akin to a Windows game-making utility than anything DOS would have done, and this style of gravity-based shooter was nearly unheard of in terms of DOS gaming, and was more common with console games and arcade games. The other reason, though, is because it's far too difficult. This first level isn't so bad, but every level onward pretty much requires 100% precision to survive, as you're given just barely enough fuel to get through, and that's counting grabbing the fuel canisters strewn throughout. Couple that with the fact that I was never good at this particular brand of shooter, and yeah, for a lot of reasons, this isn't a strong title for me. But that said, you do get unlimited lives, and all things considered, it's probably one of the more complete titles we ran across out of the ones picked. Next up, we have Soul Lapse, a text mode game created by Lowsun, designed to play like a JRPG battle system with a bit of an ambiguous story thrown into the mix, dealing with heaven, hell, souls, and hostile Japanese kitsune. Yeah, that last part there didn't really sit well with me, but I still gave it a chance all the same, and this game is definitely the start of something. The battle system has no polish whatsoever, but functions well enough, though it's very unclear what everything does, so you're going to be spending a chunk of time just trying to figure everything out. There's also a Japanese gacha thing for acquiring new souls, which I wasn't really quite sure how that worked, but still, it's another interesting thing that's tying into how this game functions. However, despite how much I don't really understand or enjoy this game, it gets a serious bump in points because of how it was actually coded. See, this is a batch file. I am dead serious. 99% of this game is an incredibly intricate batch file designed to take advantage of everything the Windows command prompt is capable of in order to produce a fully functional game, with music. If that's not in keeping with the spirit of DOS game programming, I don't know what is. Next up we have Vallah, developed by Cuprous Coup using the Unity engine. Now, at first glance, you're absolutely going to wonder why I've ranked this one in 5th place, given that it's an HD game, which doesn't seem to take inspiration from DOS gaming at all. Except its ties to DOS gaming couldn't be stronger. The whole style of building the world and its entities out of spherical shapes comes from the 1994 title Etchstatica, an extremely unusual adventure game developed by Andrew Spencer Studios and published by Psygnosis, which I haven't yet gotten around to here on ADG, but rest assured, the art style here is spot on to that game. Other than that though, this game is still in its very early stages, so you can't really do much apart from walk around the island you start on and pick up a few objects. So this one's mostly getting its ranking because it absolutely invokes thoughts of DOS gaming and has a lot of potential to tell a really interesting and artistically unique story, if the author sees it through to completion. Next up in the number 4 slot, we have Caverns of Storace Plus, a Windows game developed by CCG Software, and one of the few games in here that's fully completed. This one's actually pretty basic when it comes down to it, with the goal being to race through a bunch of screens, dodging obstacles, collecting energy to keep yourself going, and just make it to the end, at which point the skill level is taken up a notch and you can attempt an additional run. Now, this game definitely invokes the feeling of monochrome text mode games, along with having emulated PC speaker sound, although it doesn't quite nail the feel perfectly, as the screen size here is much smaller than you'd expect, with the actual text mode space only being 29 characters across by 19 characters down, significantly less than the 40 by 25 you typically see on old displays. The controls also don't feel perfect either. Being that this is emulating text mode, I'm not too surprised that the controls here are a little tricky, but one little change could have made them much better. Now, the way they work is that if you tap up or down, you'll get one space of movement up or down. Makes sense. However, if you hold up or down, you continue to get movement until the frame after you stop holding the key, whereas it would have made more sense to detect the key release state and cancel the attempt to move up or down if the player already did on the previous frame. Now, you can adapt to this for sure, but until you do, it can be pretty tricky to control your ship. Other than that, it's pretty basic, but does the job. And now it's time for the top 3. In 3rd place, we have Dust Fury, developed by Shock Design. This is essentially nothing more than an engine tech demo showcasing the beginnings of a texture-mapped 3D racing engine, invoking a similar feeling to other mid-90s racers, like Big Red Racing. So given that there's not much to do with this one and the physics aren't even complete yet, why do I rank it in the number 3 spot? Because this thing's running in actual DOS. Yeah, given how much of what we've seen so far doesn't have a DOS equivalent, the fact that someone is building their own 3D texture-mapped polygonal engine for DOS by this point in time is absolutely impressive. But admittedly, this thing has a long way to go before it's ready for prime time. And heck, as it stands, the speed of the gameplay is incredibly inconsistent. And again, there's no real physics yet. So it's a start, but it's a strong start technically. In the number 2 spot, we have Fixer, an adventure game demo created by an author known simply as Goats. Now, this one easily takes the number 2 spot for not only using CGA colors and sticking to them, but for being done in the style of a LucasArts adventure title and for being functionally complete as far as its own short demo cycle is concerned. It basically plays like the first short chapter of a much larger narrative, but virtually everything works. And there's a few generic lines of text seemingly missing, like when you try to look at characters that you can talk to, but the gameplay is otherwise flawless. I do kind of wish this one was an actual DOS title though, especially since it was the only one in this list with CGA colors. But again, this was never the point of this game jam. It was to make games which invoke the feeling of old DOS games, and this one nails it on multiple fronts. It'll be neat to see if this one ever makes it through to a fully finished state with a complete story.
3, 2, 1, go!
And then, in the number 1 spot, is the only game in the Game Jam with a registration fee beyond just $1, since it's in a fully complete state. Slipspeed, developed by Tom Voxel-Purnell with music by Margie and Fraser. Fittingly, this is the third of the 3 games we picked out that runs in DOS, and probably the most recent DOS shareware title to ever be released by this point in time, as there's both a shareware version you can download for free, and a registered version available for a minimum fee of $7, which is the one I'm showing here. This one's an overhead racing game with very simple graphics, but a large amount of content, with 8 different vehicles you can choose between, each of which have varying initial stats depending on the skill level you choose, and 16 racetracks in total, split across 4 divisions. The handling of the vehicles during the races is all about drift, so you need to start your turns early to keep your speed, and you have to avoid hitting walls too hard or you'll lose a lot of momentum in the process. Though you can improve your vehicle's stats so that you can turn better, accelerate better, reach higher speeds, or bounce off of walls without losing as much momentum. There's also both a Grand Prix mode and time trials. The funny thing is, when you really think about it, this kind of game should be failing hard because of how little leeway you have to make your turns and such, but it's actually amazingly easy to get around the courses in this game because of the design. Every course is designed with decorative arrows and large diagonal lines to help guide you into the straightaways and turns. Plus, if you take some chances, you can find alternate routes and extra cash strewn throughout. In the time trials, the cash is worthless, but in the Grand Prix mode, you're kind of expected to grab some cash as you go to upgrade your stats. Otherwise, your opponents might start to get the edge on you. Well, that said, I found the AI wasn't all too difficult, even on the highest skill setting, as the skill setting only affects how high everyone's stats are to start, making upgrades more expensive and mistakes more costly to your time and position. All of that said though, even though this is definitely the best game of the 8 we took a look at today, it also fundamentally highlights an opinion I've had for many years now, even since before starting ancient DOS games. See, I ran into performance problems with this one, and not just minor performance problems. This game ran very poorly on my Windows 10 system, using every flavor of DOSBox I threw at it. And I don't fully blame DOSBox for this one, though I kinda do, though I also kinda don't. We need to talk about desktop compositing for a moment. Back when Windows Vista was released, Microsoft developed a new desktop compositor known as Desktop Window Manager, or DWM for short. Now, this is what is responsible for producing all the special effects of the arrow interface in Vista and 7, and has since become a mandatory component of 8 and 10. And what it does is it takes the desktop and all the windows placed on it and figures out how it should all be drawn to the screen, and then does so. It's also responsible for figuring out when to repaint the various windows and how to repaint them. Although it can do this automatically, Microsoft created an interface specifically for playing nice with the compositor, so software could tell it when frames were rendered and thus were ready to paint to their respective windows. But even if software didn't do this, it usually wasn't a big deal, because the compositor was updating things well enough that games running at 60 frames per second in a window would still look right. Then came the anniversary update on Windows 10 back in August of 2016, and suddenly, changes to DWM meant playing nice with desktop compositing became very important, meaning all prior software which wasn't doing this was now sometimes rendering at 60 frames per second, but oftentimes not, yet all the while claiming to render at 60 FPS because, well, it actually was. It's just DWM didn't know and thus wasn't repainting the windows properly, doing so only when it thought it should and not when it actually should. This means tons of old software was now resulting in constant, occasional, or sporadic stuttering in frame rates despite showing a solid 60 on frame rate tickers, and unfortunately, DOSBox is one of the programs affected by this, at least at the time of making this video. Now, most DOS games don't run at 60 or even 70 frames per second, and in fact, most of them don't even use vertical sync as a timing mechanism, so it wouldn't even matter really. But Slipspeed here is a vertically synced game running 70 frames per second. As such, it was stuttering like crazy when I first tried playing it. I was recording fine, since my recording software was tapping into the back buffers, it just wasn't playing fine, and given the nature of this game, the stuttering was actually making it nearly impossible to play. Unfortunately, my screen can secretly do 70 Hz, even though it's not spec'd to be able to, so I just set up a custom screen resolution set for 70 Hz, and while this didn't alleviate the problem entirely, it helped a lot, and enabled me to capture all of this footage. But this entire experience fundamentally highlights why I don't see DOS as a viable development platform anymore, at least not for commercial purposes. whatever you make in DOS is ultimately going to be limited, not only by DOS's own limitations, but also by the hardware and software being tasked to emulate this stuff on modern systems. You not only lack some of the resources which would help you build your vision, but you lack some of the control too, meaning you're fighting the machine every step of the way. Nowadays, there's so many great tools and engines available for indie devs that the only reason you would ever want to write something brand new for DOS is strictly for the challenge, given those limitations. If you're writing a DOS program because you want to make money or merely because you want your game to run in DOS and not because you're looking for a challenge, then you are severely limiting yourself and your vision, and dooming your end result to obscurity for no good reason. As I like to tell all aspiring indie devs, make the game you want to make, that you want to play. Not the game you think people want, that you think fills a niche or has some special aspects to it. Well, those are good to have for sure, but at the end of the day, if you're not making something you want to make, you might not even come close to finishing it. Anywho, that's all for today's filler video. The next episode of Ancient DOS Games, episode 271, will be on Saturday, July 4th. And we're going to be taking a look at a first-person shooter, which I'm told isn't anywhere near as good as PC Gamer would have led you to believe. So be sure to stay tuned to see what game this could possibly be. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small random set of you guys.